What's behind the wave of populism that's seen Donald Trump elected, Britain exit the European Union, and a host of upstart parties gaining strength across Europe and beyond? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. From political movements in France and Germany to the Netherlands' Party for Freedom and Austria's Freedom Party, political parties challenging the status quo in Central and Northern Europe appear to reflect a populist, anti-immigrant stance. The voters of these so-called populist parties bear a striking similarity to many of Donald Trump's supporters, whose surprising election to the White House sent shockwaves around the world. But for all they have in common, populism can mean different things to different groups and geographic locations. To help us understand what's behind this latest trend, we've assembled a distinguished panel. Lee Feinstein is the former United States ambassador to Poland. He joins us from Indiana University, where he's currently the dean of the School of Global and International Studies. With us from Beijing is the anchor of CCTV's World Insight, Tian Wei. Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez is a frequent media contributor and teaches Latin American business at Northwestern University. He joins us from Chicago. And with us here in the studio is CCTV's Nathan King. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Nathan, let me start with you. Help us understand what we're talking about here. What is populism, and is it different depending where you are?
Well, for me this year, it's been a Donald Trump rally, because I've been to quite a few of them. It sort of defines it. But no, if you loosely, populism is the rejection of elites. It is feeling that the elites are controlling everything and banding together in a popular movement to somehow resist it. And this is what we've been seeing.
Now, here is a phenomenon that might be different from other trends that we've seen in the past. Populism comes from both left and right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can be a populist on the left or the right. I mean, you just have to look at history. Going back to the French Revolution, they had their leftists and their rightists. Danton was definitely a populist, but so was Napoleon. So it really doesn't matter which bit of the spectrum you're from politically. And in fact, it's a rejection of that sort of left and right, which often makes populists popular. Donald Trump was a Democrat 5 years ago. Is he pro-abortion? Is he against? All these sort of political definitions fall by the wayside when you have people like this.
Ambassador, if we look at Brexit, that's the British withdrawal from the European Union, would you define that as populism? And how does it differ, say, from Marine Le Pen's National Front in France?
Well, I think that in Brexit, what was experienced was a feeling by a majority of the British population that somehow the benefits of being part of the European Union, the benefits of globalization, were not being equally shared across the population. And people wanted to send a message that the system was not working as it was, and they wanted to send a strong message that something different needed to happen. In a referendum, you don't get an opportunity to write a long essay. You get a chance to vote one way or the other. And so the message that indicated that economically people did not think they had opportunity, that they felt somehow that they were challenged, that British national identity was challenged, could be best manifested with a vote to leave.
So, Ambassador, at its essence, are we talking here about something called inequality?
Well, I think we're talking about people responding to the rapid pace of change in the world, to the movement of peoples, to greater diversities in societies, to immigration, and also to technological change and the impact it has on societies. And it creates understandable anxieties for people. There are winners and losers. The issue here is leaders offering simplistic solutions to complex problems and using genuine anxieties to advance their own political purposes.
Daniel, let's look at Latin America. Where do you see populism rising in that part of the world? And is it different in any way from the kind of populism that we've seen here in the United States?
Well, that's a great question. I think that there's to a certain extent, there are some similarities. Some of the, for example, messianic sort of presences that we see among some of the right-wing populist leaders in Europe or at least in Northern Europe or in the United States, does bear certain, at least superficial similarities with a figure like Hugo Chavez, for example, in Venezuela. Where I think it differs is that, if I might add to the first comment that was made about populism being a push against elites, I think that that is true for the most part, but an important part of that is that it's also a push against institutions. These are movements that place the leader, the beloved leader of a movement, in contrast to the existing institutions, and it uses the popularity of that leader to either co-opt or sideline those institutions. And I think that that's sort of the story of Latin America. The French Revolution, was mentioned previously, where you had populism on the left and the right. During that period, France had, I believe, 10 constitutions in a period of a dozen years. That's been Latin America's experience. In Venezuela, a constitution, on average, has lasted about as long as a laptop. It's had 26 constitutions in 200 years. Bolivia's had 18. Ecuador has had 19. So there's a wave of actions between populist left and usually more of a status quo right that tends to rise and fall with commodity cycles. Populists get elected during low points in the cycle, usually, as we saw during the so-called pink tide wave 10 years ago. And then they often get overthrown or elected out of office, depending on how long they have left in their terms when commodities collapse and the economy fails. So there's definitely an economic story to be told here. But there are some fundamental differences as well.
Okay, let's bring in Tianwei from Beijing. And Tianwei, Asia has its own brand of populism. Its flag bearer right now, of course, is the Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte. He was once described as an outsider. He didn't have much of a foothold in mainstream politics in the Philippines, but he's there now. He's the leader. He's seen as a strongman populist. Is that a fair description?
Well, I think we have to be very careful, and if I could be frank here, by using the phrase, the rise of populism. Of course, at times when you see changes, there are certain phrases that are always more popular than the others. At the time, it was globalization, and now it becomes the rise of populism. I think we have to be very careful with this. Also reflected with the U.S. presidential election. If you and I could go back a little bit, look at this election, because that's where this phrase has been used most of the time, and to look at whether it is a rise of populism that is really representing so-called democracy of the majority. By the way, you know this better than I do, that the turnout of this election is not necessarily high, therefore it can't Americans voted. Secondly, you also have the popular votes going to one candidate while the electoral vote going to the other. And meanwhile, you have seen the demographic changes going on in the United States society, that the so-called the weaker party and also so-called the grassroots is not just the low-income white male anymore. It is actually a lot of different kinds of social groups and ethnic groups. So it's very hard to say that it's really a rise of populism in the United States. And so I can say about Asia, for example, in the countries of the Philippines, there are different kinds of social groups and also social movements going on over there. And certainly there is a politician who is very charismatic, using a lot of different kinds of words during his campaign. But we should give them the benefit of the doubt once they come into the office as to where the policy is going. And so do many media arguing about Mr. Donald Trump, the president-elect in the United States. So I guess it's your business back in the U.S. as to what the choice should be, but we have to be very careful with the use of the radicalism and whose interest is it really represent.
All right, you make a great point. We shouldn't forget that more people in the United States voted against the populist. Hillary Clinton actually is winning the popular vote in the United States. Nathan, when we look at the rise of Duterte in the Philippines, Trump here in the United States, Narendra Modi in India, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the Brexit phenomenon, do you see any parallels?
I do. I just want to pick up on something that Chan Wei saying, that most people didn't vote for Donald Trump. But Donald Trump was a complete outsider who basically came from nowhere, defeated 16 Republican candidates and Hillary Clinton, who was the presumptive choice of the establishment. So even though he may not have got the popular vote, his whole rise basically reflected populism. And this is where the comparison is that they've written off these people as they rose. I mean, Duterte was considered a joke by the Americans until he won. The same with the National Front in France. Marine Le Pen and, of course, her father were written off, except when they keep on actually putting dents in the political system. And they tend to have a couple of things in common. They tend to actually try and hark back to something rather than forward. Make America great again. Jean-Marie Le Pen, of course, World War II parachute hero. Duterte talking about a more comfortable time under the Marcoses, in the Philippines. But they also look to the future and say, we can't take this anymore. We're mad as hell, and we can't take this anymore. And I think the point about challenging institutions is very important. And let's face it, to some extent, in every political system, governing is based on consent.
Right.
And I think there's a feeling that by many people, it's not just economic dislocation, that they are not consulted about changes in their society anymore.
Ambassador, where do we see populist trends in Europe? I mean, to what extent is it driven by rich countries like Germany, perhaps bullying smaller, poorer countries like Greece? We saw that happen not so long ago. Does it undermine democracy? Because if we look at a party like Syriza in Greece, here was a party that had to basically roll back most of their election platform because it was not acceptable to a powerful country like Germany in the European Union.
Right. I mean, in the European Union, you have the issue of individual member states wanting to have greater control over their own economic destinies and as well as their own cultural futures. And they, in some cases, say that they oppose what they sometimes describe as diktats coming from Brussels. I think the unifying trend here is those who are favoring the idea of openness, diversity, open free economies, free expression as something that is good for their societies and their futures and their own economic opportunity, and those who believe that the solution to the problems and anxieties that they feel is closing borders, taking national solutions rather than trying to engage the rest of the world and address problems together. So in a way, I think the way populism is being manifested in Europe and elsewhere is really now a battle between those who favor openness and those who look to solutions in the direction of closing societies and building walls.
Well, let me get Daniel's view on that. Daniel, globalization, the removal of barriers, has to an extent been blamed for the rise of populism. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, that's a great question, and it has parallels to what we saw with the rise of right-wing populist movements in the 1920s and 1930s in Europe, which was also an age in which a prolonged recession led to a rise in trade barriers and a period of globalization with a lot of free movement of both capital and manpower was tampered down in response. So I think that is part of the story. And beyond that, the fall of borders and the rise of certain technologies, for example, Facebook, Twitter, which allow for a type of echo chamber ideologically, but which also tend to, barring linguistic differences, create more accessibility from one country to another. So you have more contagion in a sense. And that's something that we saw when Venezuela, for example, rewrote its constitution during the rising pink tide in 2000. You had 4 or 5 other Latin American countries rewrite their constitution within the next 8 years, completely. And that's something in which your frame of reference tends to both, as a reader, tends to both find ready ways to reinforce itself through media, but at the same time tends to cross borders. And I think that's something that makes the contagion spread a little bit more, and it is worrying, because there's very few examples in which you find a post-populist country, a country that's gone through a prolonged populist period and then returns to, let's call it institutional normalcy, and is better off than when it started.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the rising tide of populism in various countries around the world. Let's get back to our panel. Tianwei, I just want to pick up where Daniel left us, and that was when he talked about a post-populist country. He's right. We have not seen that. We have not seen a post-populist country return to some kind of normalcy. Let's take Thailand, for example, the former Prime Minister, Thaksin Shinawatra, adopted, I guess, what could be described as populist policies, introducing a low-cost healthcare program for the country, as well as subsidies for farmers. Yet, he was opposed by vested interests in the country. Would you say that those policies were successful? Because, as we know, Shinawatra is no longer there.
Well, different countries have different circumstances when one policy or another was being churned out. I wouldn't comment specifically about exactly whether that is populist policy by Mr. Shinawatra. However, may I say this, that is the populist policies, or shall I say the rise of populism, we can still use that phrase, it's a result of the blame game and the incapability of politicians to be able to look for a solution. Therefore, they would like to prefer to have a shortcut to seek political office and to satisfy what they believe as their constituencies. And of course, as a result of this kind of phenomenon, usually the populist policies are not necessarily the best policies for the country, particularly for the long term. Having said that, though, I think there is a difference between a political scandal and also populist policies. For example, at this moment in South Korea, one could also argue maybe there's a rise of populism against the establishment. However, one could also take a close look at it. That is one closely linked to a political scandal of the president right now in the Blue House. So the demands on the street by tens of thousands and the people is rather rise of populism or their correct demand for the political leadership to be responsible for what they have been doing.
Well, Nathan, what do you think? I mean, the question posed there by Tian Wei, what is the point of populism? Is it to correct what many people see as a grave injustice perpetrated by the implementation of neoliberal policies?
I think in history there's always an action and a reaction, and I think we are at a stage at the moment where the post-Cold War and post-World War II architectures are not without their critics. They're showing signs of not being as dynamic as they once were. Look at the European Union, look at the IMF, look at the UN. There's people pulling out of the International Criminal Court. You know, there seems to be a reaction against this sort of institutions. So there is that, but I also think it's a question of identity too. And you know, we've had a Pax Americana for a long time. Europe also in control, and there is identity politics.
National identity. So, at what point does populism morph into nationalism?
I think the two are very linked. I mean, there is no accident that Donald Trump's key slogan was "Make America Great Again." His foreign policy is going to be America first. Brexit saw more flag-waving Union Jacks than I ever saw when I was growing up in the United Kingdom. They are linked. And I think it goes back to identity. And we haven't really talked about race a lot. It's a difficult subject here in the US and across, but there is a questioning by large segments of the white community across the developed world of where their place is in the pecking order. White men used to go to the office and earn enough money to provide for their whole family and were never questioned, and suddenly we're in a very different society indeed. In fact, you know, it's not just economic angst in terms of white people, because if you break down who supported Donald Trump, for example, the average household income of a Donald Trump supporter, according to Pew Research, was $72,000, way higher than a Hillary supporter, and 44% of them have college degrees.
Right. Ambassador, the US President Obama, he talked about the rise of populism while he was in Greece. He's still in Europe right now. Let's listen to part of what he said.
People are less certain of their national identities or their place in the world. It starts looking different and disorienting. And there is no doubt that that has produced populist movements, both from the left and the right, in many countries in Europe.
Has the President got it right there, Ambassador?
Well, you know, I think so. I think the interesting thing is that this concern about national identity is expressed in places where there is immigration and places where there isn't immigration. And so in some cases it's a theoretical concern about a threat to national identity. So in parts of in Europe where there's the most anti-immigration sentiment, there's effectively no immigration whatsoever, that they're homogenous societies. So it is a global phenomenon, and it's fueled by fear and anxiety. I think principally economic anxiety and technological change, but sometimes confused with the idea that national identities within states are under threat.
Daniel, you talked earlier on at the beginning of the program about institutions in Latin America. To what extent is the rise of populist leaders, Cordillo as they called in Latin America, driven by weak institutions?
Well, I think that there's definitely a cyclical nature. Most of the countries that are most prone, or many of the countries that are most prone to populist movements, are also the countries that tend to have very young constitutions in which the institutions themselves have not yet begun to be able to assert themselves, and they end up being very weak. And I think that that's something that we're definitely seeing. At the same time, this conversation, attaching on to one of the statements that was made just now, I believe by the ambassador, that we have, that there's certain types of identity politics that do come into play. And I think much more so than nationalism, because you do have certain populist movements which are actually global. For example, in Venezuela, and I keep coming back to it, but in some senses it's the one I know best because I have roots there. What we saw was a leader that promised not to bring Venezuela back to a golden age, because there had never been a golden age. What he promised was to make Venezuela the spear point of a revolution that was going to sweep through Latin America. So sometimes you do have populism that's not necessarily nationalistically, but is more regionally focused.
All right, Tian Wei, you want to say something?
I think the problem may not necessarily be 100% the rise of populism, but rather how politicians are taking advantage of some of the concerns people have and some of the social movements going on right now. For example, in the presidential election this time inside your country, in the United States, there seems to be a disbelief of the so-called political correctness. But one can also argue there is a fundamental lines of values and also beliefs by a country and by a people that is the very bottom line with which a country is being established on. So when the rhetorics are about let's dismantle everything that we have had, that things have been, that people have been taking pride in, and let's establish a new society, when the new rules and new values are not there, I'm afraid the politicians are taking very much advantage of the rise of populism. But if there are correct channels in which the rise of populism can be going through and right policy can be designed, I think this is a beautiful wake-up call for the system to correct itself, and also for the politicians to know what they should be, what their responsibilities should be about. This sounds like a general argument that I make, but I think it should work in different kinds of society, of course, depending on the circumstances specifically.
Right. Ambassador, I want to get back to Europe for a moment. Germany has an election coming up. There is deep resentment in Germany against the status quo, driven, according to the Washington Post, by terrorist attacks, by Islamic radicals, and there's been a record wave of Middle Eastern migrants as well. The Post, in its article, says that this is testing the national will in Germany. Do you see major changes coming up in Germany?
Well, I think that Germany has responded with terrific leadership in dealing with the most serious refugee crisis since World War II, and in welcoming the large number of immigrants principally from the Middle East and principally from Syria that it has. And Chancellor Merkel has really stood up and taken a leadership role, not only in the EU but globally on this issue. Of course, you know, as one of the colleagues on the panel said, every action has a reaction, and there is while in Germany, I think there is still very broad support for what Chancellor Merkel has done, and also a recognition that this immigration can also be beneficial to German society and for the growth of the German economy, that there is also a fringe in Germany which is concerned about this, and while it is still a fringe, it's growing to a certain extent, and the German elections next year will be a test of Germany's approach of openness, embracing globalization, and accepting responsibility, sort of a historical responsibility and a responsibility as a leader of Europe to address the refugee crisis coming from the Middle East.
Nathan, one final thought. When we look at something like populism, is this a phenomenon that is cyclical? And to put it another way, is the pendulum swinging the other way right now? Are we going to see a return to, say, what was there in the 60s, the social welfare state?
You're asking me in a year where Donald Trump's been elected US president to make predictions? Look, yes, you can see cyclical things in history. I mean, obviously Daniel talked about the 1920s, the rise of populist parties then, severe recession, legacy from the First World War. What we haven't had here is actually, what's really interesting is we've seen rising incomes. For a long period, they've started to stagnate. But if you look at the middle class in Europe, if you look at the middle class in America, they've never had it so good. Everyone's, got enough to eat. We saw incomes rise for the middle class here and working class by the best we've seen in 20 years. So it's very interesting that even though we had this big economic crisis in 2008, the institutions held. In a lot of ways turned things around, yet we're still seeing this populism. Is it because no one's got any new ideas going forward? Is it because people just get bored? There is a lot of analysis about how Western society is too boring and people to excite them. But what we are seeing, I think, is a rejection of people like Hillary Clinton, who have spent years becoming experts in their field, who have spent years developing the language of political triangulation where you can appear to satisfy several competing groups all at the same time. There is a rejection of the art of politics as we've known it in the last 20 or 30 years. Now, where that leads, I don't know.
That's where we have to leave it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.